And now coming to the cerebrospinal fluid, we know already, we have discussed, in the subarachnoid space of the meningeal layers, cerebrospinal fluid is circulating, and we will go into the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Where is the cerebrospinal fluid secreted? From which ventricle? It is secreted specifically from the choroid plexus. It is present in which ventricle? Mainly in the lateral ventricle and the floor of third ventricle. You have choroid plexus which is giving the secretions. Okay, mainly the ependymal cells. It is one of the neuroglial cells which give rise to the secretions of the cerebrospinal fluid. So from the third ventricle, lateral ventricle, you have two lateral ventricles and one third ventricle and another fourth ventricle. So from the lateral ventricle, the CSF enters into the third ventricle through, what is this foramen? Foramen of Monroe. And then from the third ventricle, it enters into the fourth ventricle. This two lateral ventricle is present in the which part of the brain? Cerebrum. And then in the middle you have the third ventricle. On either side of this you have the thalamus. And then from the middle portion it is coming down to the fourth ventricle, which is in the pons. Brain stem you have this. And in the midbrain you have the aqueduct of Sylvis or cerebral aqueduct. This is in the midbrain. Okay, and then through the cerebral aqueduct from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, the CSF is coming. This fourth ventricle is at the location of pons. Then once when it crosses the pons, it will give rise to the central canal of the spinal cord. Then you have the medulla. From the medulla you have the spinal cord. At the level of spinal cord, the CSF circulates in the central canal of the spinal cord. So this is how the CSF secreted and it is undergoing the circulation. And apart from these foramens and the cerebral aqueduct, you have foramen of Lashka laterally and foramen of Magendie from the medial aspect. So this is the one which is bringing the CSF from the deeper structures of the brain into the meningeal layer. CSF is present in the subarachnoid space. It is the space in between the meningeal layers. Through this foramen of Lashka, foramen of Magendie, it is now going in the outer covering of the brain. Okay, this is how it has been present. And finally, after entering into the subarachnoid space, whatever fluid is being secreted, it has to be in the drainage process also. So it is drained 80% in the dural sinuses. Dural sinuses, where it is present at the level of dura mater to get all the venous drainage from the brain and its blood vessels. So along with that, dural sinus will constitute 80% of the CSF drainage. And since the CSF is also present in the central canal of the spinal cord and the outer covering of the spinal cord having the same subarachnoid space with the subarachnoid fluid CSF, spinal veins is also constituting 20% in the CSF drainage. Okay, if there is any obstruction in this pathway, you will encounter the condition called accumulation of CSF within the cavity in the outer covering of the brain. You will encounter enlargement of the head, increase of intracranial pressure, Encephalopathy, hydrocephalus, not encephalopathy. Obstruction, it may be either obstruction in the pathway of CSF or excessive secretion in the CSF or problem in the drainage of the CSF, whatever may be the cause. You have to consider it as hydrocephalus. Based on the cause, you will find whether it is communicating or non-communicating. Okay, so that is what relation to the CSF, and the place you already told between L4 and L5 you will do the lumbar puncture to drain the CSF for diagnostic investigation and also for therapeutic investigation if there is excess of intracranial pressure. And then blood-brain barrier. Most of the cases we will see these substances will not cross the blood-brain barrier. So this is prevented from entering into the brain because that substance is toxic to the brain but not to the other body cells. So what is that barrier protecting the brain from all the substances in the body? It is allowing only the required substances to the brain, not the other unwanted toxic substances. So this blood-brain barrier is mainly made by the food astrocytes. Astrocyte is one of the neuroglial cells. Okay, so this is the structural arrangement of the astrocytes. So these food process of the astrocytes are covering the entire structures of the brain, and it forms a barrier between the neural cells and the outer environment. This is connected with the help of a junction called tight junctions, which is also called as zonula occludens. Okay, so that is how this blood-brain barrier is formed in the surrounding of the capillaries in the brain, which prevents the brain from other damages.